a large part of the reason I reached out to you was because of that kind of perspective you just laid out. I think in my generation, especially, there's a battle being fought for how to view our emotions or how to view ourselves in relation to society. Is it whether are we a part of society or we just, kind of on the outshoot of it? We're just looking into society. And I think especially at a young age, how you land on that idea will really kind of dictate your how you approach your relationships around you and how you can relate to the world. So I think what I would try to do in this episode is try to break down some of these concepts that you've kind of studied and
Mm,
you've taken on for your career and see how people can relate or how my audience can
yes.
relate to their own experience. Um, so in kind of like talking about that, can you try to explain to me your idea of relational emotions? What do you mean by relational emotions?
Yeah. So what I mean by that is that when we have an emotion, we often think that it's something that occurs in our bodies and our minds. It's connected to a sensation or to a thought. So it's connected to a feeling. And of course it is. Or modern neuroscience will say, well, it's things going on in our brains. It's a certain part of our brain. If we look at people under MRI scans and, you know, we stimulate an emotion, a certain part of their brain, lights up on the MRI scan, and neuroscientists will say, well, there's the emotion. But what they often leave out is that that has to be stimulated. They're showing people pictures or, they're presenting people with scenarios. And in our lives, it's those things that stimulate emotions. So, for example, if I'm watching a TV debate, about politics, and it's an issue that really concerns me, and I start getting angry about what's being said, or I start feeling optimistic, that's about what those people are saying about an issue that I care about. It's how I relate to something in the world. Or if we're waiting for a friend in a bar and they turn up late and we're getting really frustrated, we think, well, I really like this person, but I wish they wouldn't always be so late. So what we think and feel, our emotions, are often related to events, people, things happening outside ourselves in the world around us that we relate to from our own perspective. So even simple things like you get up to go to work, it's a cold winter morning, you get in your car, the car won't start, you start getting angry, I'm going to be late for work, please, please start. So you start relating to the car as if it's a person almost. So, what we feel is never about what's purely happening inside of us. It's about that, but it's about how we relate to the world around us, the people, the things, and the events in that world.
Mm,
That's what causes us to feel and what those things mean for us as an individual, but also an individual within a particular culture, because there is a cultural shaping of emotions. So when we talk about our emotions, whether it's love, hate, anger, fear, anxiety, whatever it may be, we all have a general sense of what those emotions are like and what they feel like. So, just as the philosopher Wittgenstein once said, there isn't a private language, you could also argue, and I argue, there's no real thing as private emotion. Because even when we're feeling things when we're on our own, it's often connected to thoughts and feelings that have been stirred by other people in our lives and the things that are going on in our lives with those other people.
mm. Then in that theory, then does that mean that we understand emotions when we are kids always through our relations to others? Like, where does it come from? Where does it stem from, this understanding of relations as a social concept?
Well, our whole idea of emotions is shaped in our relations to others from when we're kids onwards. So for example, children throwing a tantrum, parents will often try to find out, what that's about. Or they may not. They may tell us, that's bad. It's bad to be angry. It's bad to behave in this way or that way. But this is how we learn what anger is. So, for example, there's an American psychoanalyst who's done a lot of research about, oh gosh, I've just had a moment where I can't remember his name now, but he's done a lot of microanalysis of the relationships between infants and parents. And he's talked about children having an emotion or maybe a hunger storm or a heat storm. You know, babies are overheated, they're hungry, so they start to cry. But adults will start to interpret this. Well, what is this about? What's the matter? What's wrong with you? And even before a child can speak, adults will be interpreting their behavior in those frameworks. So children grow up in that way to learn what emotions are. What is anger? What is love? What is neglect? What's fear? A lot of children aren't fearful of certain things, and adults have to teach them fear, like crossing a road or something like that. So we're taught what our feelings mean, and in the context of learning a language, so we have this whole emotional vocabulary in which we make sense of our feelings as they emerge in our lives at home, at school, with our family, and with our friends at school and our teachers.
Mm. I feel like yeah, there's a lot of truth to that because I feel like there's an understanding as a young person when you're growing up that your emotions, especially for example, like love or anger or jealousy, are linked to people. And so when someone says love, immediately someone will kind of like pop up into your head. And so like
Yes,
that's how we've understood things for a while, you know?
that's right. So in our families, or with our caregivers, whoever they may be, not everyone grows up in a family, but we learn certain emotional models in a way, by how our parents respond to things and to different scenarios. So we learn those models and they kind of become part of ourselves, also from our peer groups. So later on in life, we may react against that. We may struggle to adopt new models ourselves and develop new models in our adult life. Some people go into therapy to try to do those things. But all of this is connected to the world around us. It isn't just about us as individuals.
I want to also talk about interpretation. You mentioned that as people trying to understand emotions, how does one go about understanding the cause of an emotion if it's purely based on a social dynamic? You know what I'm saying? So if I can't get to the root cause of an emotion, say I've got an anxiety, I'm anxious about something, but I don't know what's
Mm.
making me anxious. How does one find out what's making them anxious?
Well, we search for it, don't we? If we wake up one morning feeling anxious, we always think, well, what am I anxious about? Do I have to give a talk? Do I have to give a presentation at work? Is a job review coming up? Do I need to have a key conversation with a partner that I'm not looking forward to? So we always search for the causes of what we're feeling. we're not just happy with the explanation that, well, today I feel anxiety. It's just something happening in my body or in my brain. We look for a cause for that. And sometimes we find it, sometimes we don't. I think most of the time we do. And often, if we don't understand our emotions, that's exactly when we go into therapy or we try some kind of technique to identify what our feelings are about.
Hmm. So what, as I understand it, it's the kind of the idea that reality exists outside of us, not just inside us.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So, what we understand of reality in our heads is a reflection of the reality around us. The world as it exists, the human-made world, all the objects in that world, the built environment, but also all the people in our lives, our culture, the meaning in our lives, things like music. You know, we learn a lot about emotions through music and, songs about love, about loss. Yeah, yeah, all these kinds of things are connected to how we develop our thinking and feeling about emotion.
Hmm. How does one then gain autonomy in this about the emotions if most emotions become it comes from other people? How does one find that?
Personal experience. So, for example, we all know what love, loss, anxiety, fear, we all know what that feels like, but we all have our personal loves, our personal losses. So, these things are common to everybody because we can talk about them now. We're talking about emotions now. So we can only do that because there's a common understanding of what they are. But then when we talk about specific emotions like love or loss, we will think about the people in our lives that we've lost. The occasions when somebody's walked out of our life or when somebody has died. And that will be unique to us as a person. Artists who write songs or write novels often say that they can never predict how people totally respond to that novel. They will read their own experiences into it. So there's an overall common understanding, but then within that, there's always room for personal experience.
Mm,
So we're never completely determined by the society around us. We're related to it, but we're not determined by it.
mm. I want to now take a slight kind of like a pivot towards understanding kind of the capitalist how alienation affects this idea, right? So you mentioned Lucien Sev before and his idea of how kind of like our existence in this is affected by the capitalist society that we live in. I think there's also an idea about alienation and how it does what it does to our sense of control. What drew you to thinking about emotions through a capitalist and an elation perspective?